So thanks for coming in to talk to me today. I wanted to talk to you about high potential and the kind of positives and negatives of personality traits, success and failure in the workplace. So disenchantment is partly to do with the potential to fail, essentially, instead of the potential to succeed. And one of the things I really wanted to focus on was the kind of positive and negative aspects of personality traits and of having extreme personality traits. But there's positives and negatives to each, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we've looked at as well. And I think a particularly important part of that as well is whether people have an understanding as to whether they fall at either end of these extreme ends of the continuum. It's something that we've looked at in Thomas International with the high potential traits. It was a study we ran. We were collecting data. We got loads of people to do the HPTI, and before we gave them their scores back, we asked them to try and position themselves and think about where it is they might score in relation to other people on each of the traits. So what we did was we got them to imagine that they were standing in a room and there were 10 other people standing in that room, all in a line. The person on the very left-hand side of the room, we said, imagine this person has the most amount of that trait in the room. The person on the very right-hand side of the room, imagine the least amount of that trait in the room. And we said, okay, what we want you to do is think about each of these traits and then position yourself in the line where you think you would score in relation to other people. We picked the kind of standing in a line task because most people at school have done some form of comparing yourself in PE, where you've got to stand from shortest person to tallest person. So they have some kind of relative understanding of how that would work. So what we then had was a kind of relative test of how accurate people were in determining whether they thought that they were extreme, whether they actually were extreme, or whether they were normal and they were actually scoring normal. We actually found something very interesting. People who fell in the middle of each of the traits, people who scored kind of normal in the continuum in relation to other people, actually knew that they were relatively normal. However, when you got to the two extreme ends of the scale, people seemed to have no idea. They had no idea of where they fell in relation to other people, and it worked both ways. It was particularly interesting for traits like conscientiousness. That was the one where we saw the biggest discrepancy and the biggest errors. At the very high end, people who were absolute perfectionists had no idea that they were perfectionists. They thought actually that other people were potentially even more detail orientated than them. Actually, it wasn't a big concern to them. And exact same at the other end, people who were very laissez-faire and self-organised actually thought there were people who were slightly more dishevelled and less kind of self-motivated than they are. Actually, they were reasonably normal. Competitiveness was the most accurate trait. People who were very competitive seemed to know that they were very competitive. People who were very not competitive, again, seemed to know that. People who really didn't like competitiveness seemed to know that. So the interesting thing comes, what is the implication of this? If people are not aware that their extremes are extremes, people aren't aware that actually they aren't in the norm in terms of their behaviour and their approach to work, how does that come across to other people?
So how do you bridge that gap between people who have different extremes on the personality traits? How do they work together well?
Sometimes there are certain traits that seem to go very well together. I think the first thing is it shows the real valuable insight that psychometrics bring, particularly things like the HPTI. Showing someone, actually, are you aware that your behaviours could be considered slightly more extreme in either the high end or the low end compared to other people? It gives them that self-awareness because it takes away kind of he said, she said. It gives them kind of objective basis to where their personality traits fall in comparison to other people. But we also see certain things around certain people tend to form better teams as well. So some research around actually having teams that are very similar on conscientiousness tend to perform better because everyone is aware that they are all performing at a similar level. So it's conscientiousness is one of these traits where a team that is defined as everyone's very high on conscientiousness, they do seem to perform very well together. They all seem to have the same high levels of standards, high levels of self-motivation. When you start to mix those groups up and start to have people who are very excessively high and excessively low, that dynamic seems to break down. On the other side, diversity in things like adjustment is actually very beneficial to a team. You get people who are excessively adjusted, excessively cool, calm and collected when the pressure's on.
And have no clue about anyone else's emotions around them because they don't care.
Absolutely not. They think, yeah, it's fine, we'll make that deadline absolutely fine. What you need to have is people in that team as well who score on the very low end of that adjustment trait scale, so that they bring a sense of urgency to it. I mean, ambiguity acceptance is one of my favourite traits, but I'm very aware of how excessive ambiguity acceptance can potentially derail a whole team. If a manager is excessively high on ambiguity acceptance, and isn't aware that they're excessively high and thinks everyone operates in that very similar way, they can be setting objectives and deadlines without any structure or clear guidance on how their team should meet that structure. So this manager might not be aware of why their team are suddenly struggling with the hugely vague objectives that they are setting for them. And the complete opposite can be the case as well. People who are excessively low on ambiguity acceptance are almost going to try and micromanage the situation, because they're going to want to put very clear structures in place, very clear guidelines in place, want to iron out every single detail before anyone moves forward. Whereas actually quite a lot of people will be very comfortable with not knowing every single detail, with allowing a little bit of room for uncertainty and complexity, so that they can start to thrive and almost experiment in the job and try and find it in their own way.
So that's a good point to end on, is just that kind of understanding of how other people work. And they are personality traits that you're probably not going to change in their lifetime, but there are different strengths and weaknesses to each of these.